call the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting of December 13th in session. George Hamner will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I'd love to.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can we have approval of the minutes from November 8th?
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
It was moved by Fagnano and seconded by Hamner.
We have a public hearing tonight, the consideration of amendments to land development regulations, chapters 911, 912, and 971, to allow outdoor vehicle storage use in the CL limited commercial and CG general commercial zoning districts, and to eliminate limitations on length of recreational vehicles stored outside on residential properties. It's legislative.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, my name is Stan Bowling. I'm the County Planning Director. This particular amendment, just want to give a little bit of background on the history of it. The Board of County Commissioners received a request from George Sigler, who owns property in the CL zoning district, and Mr. Sigler is here tonight for the hearing. The board actually discussed the issue of outdoor vehicle storage in the CL zoning district on September of this year. And then again in October, they discussed it again after reviewing some staff analysis. And the board in October directed staff to initiate an LDR amendment, and that's the amendment that's before you all this evening. And the amendment is to allow standalone outdoor vehicle storage lots in CL and CG as a special exception use, and that was a specific direction from the board. The board also in October looked at some specific criteria to limit the types of vehicles stored and some other activities and buffering, and also directed staff to incorporate those criteria into the ordinance. So that has been done, and I'll briefly go over those in just a moment. Standalone, unpaved, or paved outdoor vehicle storage lots are permitted in the existing county regulations in our heavier districts, heavy commercial CH district, and the two industrial districts, IL and IG. And they are allowed with buffering. There's no special planning and zoning commission or board approval. It's approved at a staff level. For those types of facilities, there's no restrictions on the type of vehicle stored. Anything that's on a wheeled conveyance, on a trailer, semi-trailers can be stored in those areas. And just to show you an example, we've had a few of these over the years, and actually a number of them have kind of were outdoor vehicle storage uses for a number of years, and then later on got developed to be something else. This particular shot is from within the last year. It's on Old Dixie Highway, a little bit south of County Road 512. If you look at the yellow line here, that's actually the jurisdictional line for the city of Sebastian. This is located in a heavy commercial district. You can see some contractors, trades, and warehousing type uses. The vehicle storage lot itself was developed in 1995 and is still there. Essentially, what was put in here was an asphalt apron, and then into the project itself, stabilized marl and grass cover. And you can see, and what we've noted over the years, semi-trailers stored there, sometimes heavier construction equipment. You can kind of tell that our landscape code in 1995, not quite what it is today, but there are still some trees that were 8 feet tall at the time they were installed that are along Old Dixie Highway. But that's generally what we would expect with an unpaved vehicle storage lot. And again, a lot of times it's for commercial and heavier type of vehicles. Our existing regulations allow accessory outdoor vehicle storage with a mini storage facility in the CG district, but not in the CL. And I'll show you an example of that too. One project is on the north side of Oslo Road in the 3400 block. This too was developed in 1995, and just to show you, the buildings here are mini storage buildings. You can see warehouse and contractors trades buildings. It too is in a CH district, but this is just a good example of recreational vehicles in some special parking areas. They're allowed outdoors, but in a lot of cases when they're accessory to mini storage, the buildings themselves actually kind of screen the vehicle storage parking itself. So this is on a paved surface. Also, on a stabilized and paved surface is another example. This was a project on the south side of State Road 60, Attic 60 storage, mini storage building here, and then sort of in the back and the rear is their outdoor vehicle storage next to a mobile home park out there. A little heavier buffering requirements, but again, you can see accessory to mini storage. Again, these are generally not commercial vehicles. They're vehicles that that residents have. They can't store at their house, and so that's the case with all these RVs. The occasional boat on a trailer. In looking at our existing regulations, staff surveyed other local governments. We obtained information from 8 other local governments, and there's more information in staff's report in your backup. Of all those that were surveyed, all allowed outdoor vehicle storage in general commercial and general business districts. They required buffering, and there was no restriction on the type of vehicle stored. None of them allowed outdoor vehicle storage in limited or light commercial districts. But again, none of them had some of the restrictions that are proposed with this ordinance that's before you this evening. The Board of County Commissioners' directive was to allow but carefully regulate these uses in the CL and CG district, and that's why I think they directed us to have this arranged to be a special exception process, since there's notice to surrounding property owners and public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Commission and the board. There are also 6 criteria that the board reviewed, and those have been incorporated into the ordinance. So the proposed amendment would allow, if adopted, standalone paved or unpaved outdoor vehicle storage lots in the limited commercial and the general commercial district as special exception use. The 6 criteria that are in the proposed ordinance, the first one deals with parking surfaces approved by Public Works. Public Works has standards they apply to unpaved surfaces that can bear up with vehicle storage. There's also special buffering proposed, a type B buffer with a 6-foot opaque feature wherever any one of these facilities would be located adjacent to residentially designated property, and a type C buffer with a 6-foot opaque feature along major roads and wherever it abuts districts other than CHIL, and that should be IG rather than CG. Also in the proposed ordinance is an allowance for the opaque feature to be satisfied by fencing with vines. We put that option in after discussing it with Mr. Sigler and seeing some success with that type of option. These sorts of facilities are always secured with fencing, which makes sense. And so usually that's chain link fencing, and the use of vines can be a pretty fast growing and a pretty easy to maintain opaque feature. And in the case where these would be used, no shrubs would be necessary as part of the buffer itself, because you essentially have more or less a green wall. The type B buffer, just by way of reminder, is the typical type of type B buffer is 25 feet wide and consisting of canopy trees, which are shown here larger, and then understory trees. And again, if a fence with vines were used, no shrubs would be required under the proposed regulation. The type C buffer is not as intense and not as wide, with native vegetation, which is pretty easy to use. It's a 15-foot width is required, and again, no shrubs would be needed if a vine and fence type of setup were proposed. Continuing on with the criteria, shielding of outdoor lights is in the criteria. We have standards that we apply in corridor parking lots, which works pretty well and pretty easy. That's proposed. A prohibition on storing semi-trailers, dump trucks, or similar vehicles. Again, this is only in CL and CG districts. And what we found is that most of these types of facilities would be used by surrounding residents, and it would be RVs and perhaps boats on trailers, but no dump trucks or similar vehicles. Also, the proposed criteria would prohibit storage of materials, construction materials, lumber, any kind of merchandise. It would be for the vehicles only, and there could be no sales of vehicles from these lots. It's a totally different use, and no repairs of vehicles outdoors. Again, that would be considered a different type of use and have their own standards. Just a few other items with this proposed amendment. Besides coming up with some changes that would allow standalone facilities in the CL and CG district, we modified the regulations for mini store to have accessory outdoor storage with many storage facilities. And so we updated those criteria to line up exactly with the proposed criteria for standalone. I do want to make a correction on the record. On page 7 of the ordinance, one of those modifications deals with outdoor storage of vehicles accessory to many storage facilities in the CG district. That type of a proposal does not go to the Board of County Commissioners. It goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and so we would replace the wording Board of County Commissioners with Planning and Zoning Commission. One other item that is addressed in the ordinance and was a directive from the Board of County Commissioners was to modify what is essentially an outdated sort of regulation we have right now for RVs, where we have one RV is allowed to be parked outdoors at a single-family parcel. There's under the current regulation, there's a limitation of a 32-foot length for RVs, which might have been kind of the norm back 20, 25 years ago, but it no longer is so. There's also a variance procedure that's in that requirement, and essentially what's being proposed here is to do away with a length requirement and go simply with an overall length times width requirement of 400 square feet. And that's the way an RV is defined in the county code and in the state law as well. That's the other item that's in the proposed amendment. Staff's recommendation is that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend the board adopt the proposed amendment, and I'd be glad to try to answer any questions that you all might have.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have one. Back on your buffering, Stan, you know, as a habit, the multifamily is considered commercial. How do we buffer multifamily? If this happens, I don't know whether we do we abut multifamily, or is that going to be considered family and be a type B buffer?
Right. There are other buffering requirements in the zoning district, and where CL or CG abuts multifamily, there's a type C buffer. So despite the specific criteria that we have here, those general criteria would apply, so you'd always have at least a type C buffer in that situation.
Okay, because that's the only rub we get a lot is sometimes between multifamily, like it or not, considers themselves single family, close together residential, and sometimes they don't think of themselves as multi-units like we do. And so I think if we're going to do this, in most cases, we tend to err on the side of caution. So I don't know if you want to bump that to B, but if it's necessary. But I think that's the only thing that I would, think you need to be careful a little bit about.
And again, that's a general requirement in our code. Any type of development, it could be a store in CL. If it's adjacent to multifamily, it has at least a type C buffer requirement.
Are unpaved and stabilized surfaces the same?
Excuse me?
Are unpaved and stabilized surfaces the same?
They're not the same. A stabilized surface might be a compacted marl, kind of almost like road base, but not an asphalt sort of covering or surface to it. Paved is obviously going to be asphalt or concrete, and you tend to have more runoff in that situation and have probably more area dedicated for stormwater use.
So there are really three surfaces then. There's paved, unpaved, and stabilized.
Well, unpaved and stabilized, they go together. They're really the same category. Anything that's unpaved would have to still be stabilized.
Yep. And so getting to the runoff, are there any provisions for dealing with runoff from these types of areas?
Yes. When they come in with their request for either special exception or administrative permit approval, there's a site plan that goes with it. And depending on the type of surface that's proposed, there's a coefficient for runoff, and the calculations are done for drainage to accommodate depending on the type of surface that's proposed. So that'll all be handled by staff, and it's already handled with our stormwater regulations.
Right, and that seems pretty important based on the insert that you provided us about from the LA Times about who is responsible for runoff, and the Supreme Court interest in that.
Yes.
And that seems a pretty important thing to consider.
The regulators are regulated. That is correct.
So if we adopt this amendment, it will ultimately come back to us potentially via exception, where we'll have to decide whether the 6 criteria have been met. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's exactly right.
Stan, in this case, on the west side of this piece of property, it butts up to residential.
That's correct.
So if they did a chain link fence with vine, then they'd still have to put in the trees, but not the shrubbery?
That's correct. They'd have to put in the understory and the canopy trees. It makes sense that there'd be no need for the shrubs,
Right,
really, in a
yeah,
sense,
sure.
because you're essentially going to have a green, what's going to look like a green wall in that situation.
Any other questions?
Yes. Stan, is the 400 square feet big enough for today's recreational vehicles?
Yes, actually, doing a little bit of research, most recreational vehicles are still on the order of 8 to 9 feet wide, and 40 feet seems to be about the longest of any of the popular or largest type.
Because the definition of recreational vehicle calls for the 400 square feet to be measured in the setup mode. Now, with today's RVs that have the sliders that go out, if you have a 45-foot motorhome that's 8.5 feet wide, you're at about 375 square feet. Now, I mean, how picky or technical are we going to get once you do the setup mode and push all your sliders out?
If it's stored in the driveway in the setup mode, that's when we're going to measure it that way.
And the second thing, I'm thinking that a lot of RV folks that you see on the road have a trailer that they tow behind their motorhome. Will this be allowed on this type of use, on this type of storage area?
Well, we have regulations that allow, for instance, if they have something on the trailer, like a boat on the trailer, that can be stored, that can also be stored on a single-family lot.
And I'm just thinking whether, an enclosed trailer where you might have RVs, motorcycles, what have you, just a regular enclosed vehicle behind the motorhome, would you be able to store that on this same lot? Or would that have?
Yes, you
Wouldn't
can
it be separate?
It would be
Yeah,
considered
two
two
vehicles.
vehicles?
Yes, in other words, and the regulations we have regulations specifically just for the recreational vehicle, but also for boat storage on a single-family lot. But it is generally limited to one when it's outside storage, one of each.
Okay. Any other questions? This is a public hearing, so I'll open the public hearing. Any comments by the public? If you'd like to address the commission, please state your name and address. Anybody want to talk?
Would anybody under
Hey, we
20
got
years
one.
old like to talk?
Well, I'll just make a quick comment. I am George Sigler, and I appreciate your considering this. I have had this lot for a number of years. I was going to build an upscale, and I may later. That's why I'm looking at this vehicle storage right now. But my original plan was to build a doctor's office or a professional building on that property. But until the economy gets better, I'm not going to do that. But I get a lot of people, because my office is just across the street from this property, come in and inquire about storing their RVs or boats on the property because there's so many subdivisions now in that area, and soon, hopefully, within the next few years, south of us, that will have need for storing boats and RVs, depending on the regulations of the subdivision. So that's one reason that I am requesting this, and my intent is not to pave it ecologically. I'd rather have the water run off instead of paving the area. And so I appreciate it again very much. I think it'll benefit the people that are in that area that would like to store their RVs or boats.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to address the commission? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, what's your...
I'll make a motion to approve staff recommendation.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion made by Todd Brognano and seconded by Jonathan Day. We're done.
We're done.
Yeah.
Oh, commissioners matters. Any commissioners matters?
Nope.
Nope, no, I don't think so.
Any planning matters?
Just a few, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, no.
It's the end of the year. We got a few things to wrap up here. A few items the Board of County Commissioners considered that you all made recommendations on since your last meeting. One was the South County Algal Turf Scrubber, and they approved it as you all recommended. The Accessory Structures Land Development Regulation Amendment, They approved that as you all recommended with that 3-year extension, limitation on extensions that was incorporated into it. The McDonald's request for sign regulation amendments, they did not go with your recommendation, but approved pretty much as proposed. And we have no more
They're not
scheduled meetings till
perfect, no.
January.
They're just not perfect. That's the only
Well,
problem.
So again, we don't have anything scheduled till January. We don't know of anything for sure that's scheduled yet. We'll let you all know as soon as we know. And Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas. Do we have any attorney matters?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, that's priceless.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Very good,
Appreciate
Carol.
that.
In the seat of
Her
power.
1-week contract didn't last very long.
Meeting adjourned.
I know.